All right, so we are in our class on the resurrection of Jesus. Just a recap, as we have several people who have either not been here or not been here recently. We're talking about the core facts of the resurrection. And what we mean by the core facts are the pieces of information that are agreed on by everybody who studies the subject, whether they're a believer, a skeptic, or an atheist. And so all of these core minimal facts that are agreed upon, virtually unanimous. And so we talked about 5 different facts: that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified by the Romans, that his disciples sincerely believed that they saw him alive again, that Paul, the church persecutor, was transformed, and then that Jesus' tomb was empty. And so we looked at those, and we are assuming that the best explanation for that information is the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. That's what the original witnesses said was the explanation for it. But in this packet, the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at other explanations that have been given over time. So there's been objections and other explanations given to explain the facts ever since it happened. So what we've talked about is just some broad categories and some specific ideas of, for instance, that maybe the whole thing was a fraud, that either the disciples stole the body, or someone else stole the body, or even maybe that Jesus didn't actually die in the first place. And all of those, we showed that there are tremendous problems with them. So then we looked at, well, maybe the whole thing was a hallucination of some kind on the part of the disciples, and that doesn't really work either. So we've been talking about this idea of, well, maybe it's just a legend. And we said at the beginning of this packet that this is probably the most popular alternate explanation that there is going to be today. So I shared with you that quote at the beginning that really, in general, the most popular opinions for those who don't want to accept the resurrection is something happened, but we can't really know what it is. And if we are going to say, then it's probably that the disciples saw something and then embellished the story. So we've been talking about generally about the fact that it's a legend, and the idea that, well, maybe the resurrection is just a religious myth, like you find in other religions. And so we discussed that on Wednesday. Do we have any lingering questions or anything that we want to say about that? I'm sure you just have all of your thoughts organized and remember everything we talked about on Wednesday, because there was a lot there.
Like we talked about on Wednesday, this is the most logical. Just to say, I don't really care much about it. I don't really want to investigate much about it.
Yeah. It's
just one of these religious things that you religious people believe, just like, people believe in aliens and, outer space life and all the other things. They just lump it into, well, that's cool for you, but it's just something that is kind of made up.
It makes sense,
yeah.
Right? Because that's what we do with everything else, right? Say, well, it's obviously just some kind of legend or some kind of myth, right? And so, yeah, if you're not particular to Jesus and his story, then it makes sense why somebody would say, it's just, some story that people made up, and just kind of leave it there. But like we're talking about, when you start looking at the details and you pick that apart, it just doesn't work. Andrew?
I hadn't thought about this earlier, but the authors of the Gospels wouldn't have the literacy or the access to historical context that if we're saying, oh, they borrowed from an Egyptian myth or they borrowed from some other culture, where would they, they didn't have libraries that they could just go and check out those books and read up on Osiris and then decide to write their own version. If these were poor Jewish fishermen and so forth, then they only would have had what was immediate to their culture or to their existence. There were historians and there were scholars in that time period, but they were their own set-apart profession and really class people in society.
Yeah, it would have either had to be common knowledge or they would have had to have been educated people, and neither one of those is really the case. So what we talked about, and I want to share this quote that we said, is, I don't have it pulled up on my notes. So this is just sort of a summary of what we talked about with the idea of it being a religious myth. that although some skeptics today would like us to believe that resurrection claims in other religions cancel out, I still didn't change that, cancel out Jesus' resurrection, when we look more closely at them, we note that the accounts themselves are unclear, that they lack evidence for the event, and that they fail to explain the known historical data concerning Jesus' resurrection. So we looked at a couple examples, and when you start picking apart the details, you realize it's not really clear what these legends are claiming, that there's actually a lot of difference between them and Jesus. And so, remember, we looked at ones like Osiris that Andrew brought up, who was the god of the underworld in Egypt, and it was basically, the story is maybe he became a zombie and was then put into the netherworld, but that does not match Jesus. And we also said, even if all those, are parallels, it doesn't explain this information about Jesus. Even if it is close, and we can say, oh yeah, there are some parallels, or there seem to be some borrowed, we still have to explain these facts that point to Jesus being something more. So then we started talking about this idea of, well, maybe it's not a myth, but maybe the disciples embellished the story somehow. And this is probably the most popular right now, at least in academic circles, and I think it's going to start getting its way into popular media. And so you'll read books that basically say, well, at some point between when the events happened and then when they were written down in the New Testament, the disciples changed it up a little bit. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe they said, oh, we need to make this bigger. Or maybe it was unintentional, just like telephone we talked about, where one person says one thing and it builds on itself. But yeah, those claiming that the resurrection story is a legend will usually say that at some point between Jesus' death and then when the New Testament was recorded, because remember it was an oral culture, that either intentionally or unintentionally the story was added to. But we did say, and I want to say again, the question is not about, is the stuff that's written in the New Testament reliable? So as I said, it is agreed upon across the board that what is in the New Testament was what was originally written. There's just an embarrassment of riches with the textual history of that. So that's not what we're talking about. We're saying, was it changed before it was written down? So that's what we're talking about today. So what are your initial kind of reactions and what you think about when you hear ideas like this? Andrew?
My first reaction was it is somewhat understandable, because if you look at church history, the way stories in the Bible have been, in a way, embellished or mythologized. I'm thinking about, you look at these Renaissance paintings of the life of Jesus, and they're these picturesque, full of white people for some reason, but these picturesque scenes.
Because white people were painting them, that's why. Yeah.
Beams of light shooting out everywhere, and symbols and people pointing and gesturing in these dramatic ways. And it does kind of put an embellished view of history in our minds, where there's other portrayals of Jesus' life while he was on earth that are much more humanizing, and those can kind of jar us a little bit, because we realize, oh wait, this was just a human story, not something from a Renaissance book.
Yeah, you can see why somebody would say it. An example that I think about a lot is the three wise men at the birth of Jesus, where never anywhere does it say that there's three wise men, but there's traditionally some names for them, right? It just says that there was wise men from the east, and they brought three presents, and so then it was kind of added on, well, then there must have been three of them, right? And we don't even think about that stuff. Sometimes it just happens, and that's kind of what is being said about this. But I want to take it back to what our original source that we're using is. Where are we about to go for those of you who have been in this class? 1 Corinthians 15. Yeah, absolutely. So let's turn there again. Won't be the last time, definitely not the first time. So why are we spending so much time talking about 1 Corinthians 15 and these few verses in here?
Because historically it's the closest text to Jesus' death.
Yeah, so Paul talks about, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, that you received. And then in verse 3 he says, I delivered to you what I also received. And so then when you start using the historical benchmarks and you work your way back, it becomes evident that what is here in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 through probably 5, and then Paul seems to add some stuff, historically is the earliest source of information that we have about what the apostles said in the New Testament. And we don't have the time to obviously rehash all of that, but the point being, this is the earliest record that we have in the New Testament of what the apostles actually taught. Paul says, this is what I received, when the traditions that I got when I became a disciple. It goes all the way back there. So if we look at the top of page 7, number 1, page 7, it says, how long did we say was the time between when the traditional material that Paul repeats here was created and then when Paul received it himself? Because remember, he had to receive it before he gave it to the Corinthians, right? And it had to be in circulation before that. So how long did we say was in that gap between when this was probably originally created and when Paul got it? Yeah, less than 10 years. Sit with that for a second. Less than 10 years. And that's not just, select believers saying it. That's across the board. It is agreed upon by academics that, probably at maybe 10 years that this was written. Maybe within months, actually, of Jesus being crucified was this developed. And you can see that it was written in this way for memorization, these repeated phrases and all this, that this was a traditional material that was repeated and memorized and was probably developed within 10 years of Jesus' death. That's huge. So in those couple of paragraphs after that question, just to kind of bring it back to what we're talking about, this means that this tradition, which contains all the core facts of the gospel and claims the resurrection as the explanation. So we look at this. Paul says, what I gave to you that I received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and the 12. He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he says, then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared also to me. All of that, the apostles were saying within 10 years. That's not this giant gap that we have. But this is our earliest record for what it was that the original disciples were claiming. And if you're not spending time thinking about these things and reading these things, you can read that and be like, yeah, so what? 10 years, that's still a long time, right? So I gave you an example here, just to compare. So everybody's heard of Buddhism, right? I assume. So the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, it's thought that he probably lived about, 560 to 480, right? So he was actually in some of that Old Testament period with the prophets. So that is when he lived. We'll just round it and say about the year 500. The first recorded teachings that exist from the Buddha were written in about the 1st century BC. So he lived in about 500. The first recorded teachings of him are in 100. How does the math check it? How long is that? 400 years. 410 are very different, in case we don't realize that. 410. And this, again, is to point to Buddhism is one of the major religions in the world, right? And the teachings of the Buddha are venerated and held. But from when Buddha actually lived to the first record of his teachings is about 400 years. There is a period of at least 200 to 400 years between when the Buddha lived and the record of which he taught. And there's, a little bit more to it than that, different traditions of information and things. But that's what we're dealing with, right? What we have in 1 Corinthians 15 within 10 years. With Buddhism, 400 years. Or even with Islam, for instance. Muhammad lives in 500, and it's not, I believe, until about 50 years that there's actually a collection of his writings about what he said. You know, what we have with the message of Jesus is just different in terms of historical record. Okay, do you have any questions about that? Does that make sense? And like Andrew said on Wednesday, don't be afraid to say, I don't know what you're talking about, right? Again, if we're not understanding, it's not you, it's the explanation that we're given here. So that makes sense to everybody, right? That the comparative time for the record of Jesus is honestly just way better than anything else, okay? Right. So we're looking at that. And the point of saying that is, so is there really time for some kind of legendary embellishment there? These are oral cultures, you know, they are way better at remembering information than we are, right? They're not literary, in the same way that we are. So they were repeating things and remembering them. This was an oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. 10 years is just really not that much time, okay? So number 2, does embellishment, can that account for the sincere belief of the disciples that we talked about with fact 3? We said that they sincerely believed they saw Jesus again. It was clear that they were not intentionally lying. They weren't conducting a fraud or a conspiracy of some kind. Can saying that this was all an embellishment on their part account for that sincere belief that led them to suffer and to die for what they were saying? Emily, what's behind that face that you just made?
I mean, not really. I think if you're going to say that the disciples embellished the story over time, you would have to then say that the disciples' suffering is embellished.
Okay.
Because I don't think that you can believe that, like we've said earlier, like no one's going to lie and then die for something they've lied for. And so the fact that people are claiming it's an embellishment, then we have to believe that their suffering would be an embellishment. Because, again, why would you die for something if you're just stretching the truth?
So it raises more questions that need to be answered than solving the problems. Yeah. So to say that, that they embellish it, then that doesn't make sense of the fact that they were willing to suffer and die for this when they weren't gaining anything. So then we have to explain that. And so instead of answering the question, it just raises more questions. I think Andrew had his hand up, and then we'll get Greg in here.
I guess my thought was, if there is embellishment, there's no evidence of what the starting point of the story was. We don't have an early version of the Gospel of Mark that just talks about Jesus being a good teacher and the story.
Yeah.
We only have records of the story in its finalized form. And you also have the issue of, if there was a starting point of the story that was plausible, and then it became a resurrection story, embellishment is small steps, small incremental gaps. At some point, you've got to cross the chasm of claiming resurrection from the dead, or, any of the other miraculous things, really. If it's just a matter of embellishment, you've got big, big jumps to cross over that can't just be a little bit of bending the truth here and there to eventually get to the story we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's an important point to say, there's embellishment or some kind of legendary development. Okay, where do you find that? It's not there. That's the point. These are the earliest sources that we have. Everybody agrees on it. And already they're saying Jesus died and rose from the dead and appeared to all of us. And there's not any other competing record for what happened. There's just not evidence of it. Greg?
When you keep talking about is there enough time, I think you're making reference to the fact that Jesus' teaching and ministry and healing and miracle performing occurred throughout all the regions of Judea, in Jerusalem, the capital city, and that those who were not part of the movement, if you want to call it the movement, were clear witnesses of what transpired. And where you really needed time was where Jesus said you need time. You have to have time to process this and put it all together and come up with a supernatural answer to your questions. Because that was the leap that had to occur, as Andrew was talking about. They had to
there's too much evidence of supernatural activity. And as the gospel begins to spread in Acts, they say in Acts 10 and Acts 17 and other places, you've seen these things happen. You are aware of the ministry of Jesus. You know of the accounts of the miracles, and many of you see them yourselves. So that is the time to go, well, I just can't continue to refuse the overwhelming evidence, and I have to accept that this is of God. Because that was not their first inclination in anything they were considering.
Yeah, so we looked at that, right? With their belief, with Paul even, their first jump was not to say, oh, Jesus raised from the dead. When they saw the empty tomb, when he appeared to them, they were confused and just shocked. And what do we do with this? You know, they saw the empty tomb, and it says that Mary and some of the other women were saying, they stole Jesus' body, and we don't know where he put it. You know, they weren't jumping to the fact of, oh, obviously God raised him from the dead, because as they say from their own records, we didn't have a clue what he was talking about when he said that. It was so confusing. But they do process it, and they come to this realization that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And is it just is it these facts? You know, is it the empty tomb and things like that that convince them? What do they say actually convince them of what happened?
Jesus appeared to them.
We saw him. We talked with him. We ate with him. We spent time with him after the fact. He appeared to us, and that's why we're saying that this is what happened, because of that whole thing.
And he showed him the wounds too, where he was
Yeah.
wounded on the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, what were you going to say?
If you flip the question around, embellishment doesn't explain their sincere belief. But as an outsider, one can argue their sincere belief led them to embellish it. It wasn't intentional. But then we get to, like Andrew and Greg said, at some point, you've got to get to beyond the plausible, beyond the legend, and beyond what makes sense. I mean, the resurrection. And then you look at the facts that support it. When you look at it all together, embellishment doesn't fit. But from an outsider, again, you know, there was a lesson done here years ago that the title of it, Does a Fish Know It's Wet? You know, when you're inside of it, when we believe it, it's our core, we're like, well, yeah, that doesn't make sense. But from an outsider that doesn't have that core belief, you can say, well, yeah, but. And if you accept all the facts that we've talked about, that these are factual, historical, proven events, embellishment doesn't fit.
Yeah.
But you can argue sincere belief could, you know, lead to embellishment. We see that in our own lives. You know, people that know, you know, someone in your life after they're gone, you talk about them, and sometimes the stories get bigger and their actions get better.
Fish stories, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we're not saying that can't happen. It does happen. We're saying when you look at this information with that lens or try to explain it that way, it doesn't work. You know, the fact that they would suffer and die for this after having made it up or added to it, it just does not work. Angie?
Well, going off of that too, if you have somebody who embellishes that story, the next person isn't going to have
It's not going to be the same thing.
story.
Yeah.
And yet they did.
Yeah, that's the thing too. Over this wide time period, different areas, different individuals, they're all saying the same thing. This is what we experience. Jesse?
Also, we kind of skirt around the issue. We see the torturings
Yeah.
that people go through today. We need to compare them with the torturings that they did then, which was really horrendous.
Yeah.
39 stripes, save one with the cat o' nine tails. They had bits of bone and metal and everything else.
Mhm.
So you end up with rip the flesh from the body.
Yep.
I mean, it was, we look at torture as, okay, yeah, a person went through a little bit of pain for a while. Then, I mean, it was life-altering pain and torturing they went through.
Yep.
And a lot of them were hung upside down, they were, ripped asunder, they were just horrible torture.
Absolutely. We looked at that, kind of specific information, and fact 2 is what happened to Jesus, and also fact 3 and their experiences. And there is nowhere in any of history any record of one of the original disciples going back on what they said. And they did suffer and die. Most of them, as far as tradition says, were martyred, executed for these things, whether it was in their same location or they went elsewhere. And there's no record anywhere of any of them going back on it. And if it was a lie, human nature and experience tells us it's going to come out eventually. And it didn't. Emily.
I think that's kind of the other thing, kind of along with the fish story and how the story didn't keep getting bigger, it stayed the same. And I think that if you embellish a story, even if it was on accident, this is a gospel of love and honesty and respect for people. And I think that someone would have written something kind of been like, these are what the disciples are saying, this is not true, this is what truly happened. I don't think that they would be able to get so many people to agree to embellish a story, accidental or not.
Yeah. And part of that takes it back to they're doing this in Jerusalem, right? Around all these same people that put Jesus to trial and executed him and buried him and all of that. And they're claiming these things in that spot. If it wasn't true, it's not going to get off the ground. Because again, all they have to do is walk over to the tomb and say, here's Jesus. He's right there. And Christianity is dead. But they're in that same spot where all these things happen and say, yeah, this is what occurred. And there's no record anywhere, except for what we have in Matthew 28, of anyone saying, no, they're lying, it's not true, this is what actually happened. And again, even with that explanation in Matthew 28, we see that his enemies are still trying to come up with explanations for the same information. The fact that Jesus' body was gone, and they didn't know what happened to it. Jesse?
And also, too, if somebody would have stolen the body would have been discovered somewhere along the way.
Right. I mean, yeah, what do you do with it after that? That's a whole other thing. Those things just raise more questions instead of answering our questions, really. So let's go to number 3 here on page 7? Yeah, page 7. So we talked about the disciples, but we had also spent time talking about Paul, who made it his life's mission to wipe this movement off the face of the planet. Can legendary embellishment explain why Paul of Tarsus claimed to see the risen Jesus? So maybe we say, yeah, the disciples came up with some kind of fish story. Does that explain Paul of Tarsus?
I'd say no, because he dedicated against his persecuting the Christians. Why would he change if it wasn't true?
Yeah, I mean, he was not sympathetic to it. Aaron, what were you going to say?
His embellishment would almost fuel him to be more adamant against it.
I think that's probably what he thought was going on. When he's hunting down the Christians, he knows that there's record of the fact that Jesus' body is gone. So he probably is thinking the disciples stole the body and then they made up this story that he rose from the dead. I'm sure this is exactly what Paul thought. That is not going to convince him that it's true. He says, I saw Jesus myself. That's what changed me. It wasn't any kind of embellishment. Like you said, that would fuel him even more of, again, he thought it was his divine mission from the law of Moses to kill all these people as blasphemers. Not just argue with them, but he would take them into the synagogue and beat them. And if they didn't, recant, then they would be delivered for execution. He thought, this is what God wants me to do. And an embellishment doesn't make a lot of sense of that. So, as we said, there's a couple things I want to talk about here at number 4. Is there evidence of embellishment somewhere? Some detail or just the way the story's told maybe? Is there evidence that, maybe it was changed before it was written down? You hear the crickets, right? Yeah. Emily?
I don't think so, because you have those other gospels that were written at later points where it obviously takes a jump from a story that kind of cohesively makes sense and you have a lot of background evidence to support to he became this insane mythical being. And so I don't think that you can look at this and say, well, here's where the jump is. They went from something that made sense, and there's more evidence behind it, more details behind it than what an embellishment would be able to produce.
Right. So we look at the gospel records, right? They're telling the story. They're very straightforward, matter of fact in what they talk about. In fact, we wish that they would give us more details on a lot of things, and they just don't, because they're just saying what happened. But we get a couple generations removed when we would expect that there would be some embellishment, and there are, false gospels written, like the Gospel of Peter, where the cross comes out of the tomb and starts talking to everybody. That's different than what we have in Mark, Matthew, and John. So that's an important thing. And what was the other thing that you talked about? You said a few things, and I was like, I got to mention both of those. No? You're supposed to remember.
Words just come out of my mouth and I
Dude, we're too young for this. Okay. I think Greg had his hand up, so we'll go over here.
You brought up the false gospels. So those were attempts at embellishing the story.
Yeah.
Now, what was the motivation behind someone doing something like that? Did they want to include themselves in the list of authorship of those that could give testimony of Jesus? Were they trying to sell books? It's like an accomplished author who wants to go and sign books and this kind of stuff. What was in it for them? But the reason that we don't have those embellished texts as part of the Bible today is because the people who were eyewitnesses to what occurred were diligent enough to be selective in what became the body of work of the apostles and disciples that were credible. And that's because when it was still an oral story, it was to trust these things to faithful men.
Yeah.
What I'm teaching you today. So there were plenty of self-appointed editors who were willing to say, well, that's just bunk. I was there, so I can remember. I was a younger man then, but I haven't forgot everything I knew. So even we know that there are attempts to embellish. We know that those attempts were unsuccessful, and we know why they were unsuccessful.
Yeah. And that was what Emily was talking about, and I made sure to write down so I don't forget it again. That, people came up with things and explanations and alternate theories and things, but there was this controlling influence of the eyewitnesses. They were around for a while. And what happened when somebody would come up with something contrary to the story? Think, for instance, of like Acts 15 as just kind of an example of how this works. Did they just let everybody say what they wanted to say? And the apostles convened a council, right? There was this controlling influence of, no, that is not what happened. That is not what is said and what has been taught. And correcting the record. And we see that with the apostles, that they had this controlling influence of the eyewitnesses. If somebody was saying, oh, this thing happened, this thing happened, this thing happened. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, most of those 500 people who claim to see Jesus alive are still here. You can go talk to them. And if they're hearing people say something that wasn't true, no, that's not what happened because I was there. And that is also something that we have to think about and talk about. Alicia?
You also see that throughout even the epistles and all the books in the New Testament, you see that as false teachers came up, they were corrected by the eyewitnesses and the apostles and the people that knew the truth. And like the letters to some of the churches throughout the New Testament, there's mention of don't follow these false teachers because what they're saying is false. And so they were very adamant to make sure that the gospel and the message of Christ did not get changed over time.
Yeah. And somebody could spin that and say, see, it was a conspiracy. They didn't let anything different happen. But what we're saying is it was the same story from the beginning, right? And to say that that was a conspiracy, then we're back at square one and we have to explain all of these same things that we're trying to explain that just don't work. The point is that the original eyewitnesses controlled and they kept the true story. This is what happened, and there's not any evidence that it was changed. Margaret?
And one of the things that they also refer to is this is what was prophesied. This is the fulfillment of the prophecy.
Right.
And the prophecy as far as his death and resurrection was in great detail.
Right.
And the detail was the same. But when you look at the embellishment and the thought of that, the stories that were told were less than what happened, not more than what happened. So they tried to kill the story of the resurrection. And so while it might have been embellishment, it was more change.
Yeah, so
Instead of making bigger than it was, they made it littler than it was.
with those prophecies, for instance, of, all of this clear record of what was going to happen with the Messiah, did they understand all of that
No.
right away? No, they didn't have a clue.
And yesterday in our Bible study, we talked about that fact because we were studying Luke and the fact that they did not understand. And then, even after he appeared to them, it says then that that there was a time after he, and actually it's in Luke 24:45.
Yeah.
And it was after he showed them his hands, and after he ate the meat, and then.
All the scriptures, yeah.
That all these things were in the Psalms that would happen to me, and that is the point that it says. Then he opened their understanding that they might understand the scriptures. And they said, and that at that point, Luke records that.
Yeah.
Because before that, in I think it was, the 18th chapter, it says they did not understand these things, and it was hidden from them.
It took Jesus to explain all this,
Yes.
right? And that's another thing is to say that they embellished this and came up with the story. Where on earth are they getting this from? Again, they were not educated. They were just random guys. And what they were saying about resurrection of this individual person who had been publicly cursed by God by being crucified is completely unprecedented. Nobody had ever said something like that before. And so to say that these 10 or so peasants came up with that story and then were able to link it to all of the history of the Hebrew Scriptures, how are we explaining this? I want to share a quote real quick from somebody that said, nobody was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have generated such ideas. Nobody would have invented it, no matter how guilty or forgiven they felt. No matter how many hours they poured over the Scriptures. And this is what he says. To suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter in a fantasy world of our own. There's just nowhere to explain where they came up with this. We talked about that in some earlier facts. Of nothing in the Jewish world, nothing in the Greco-Roman world was anywhere close to what they said happened with Jesus. So they came up with a totally new thing on their own and then essentially pulled off the greatest conspiracy in the history of the world, if that's what we're saying happened. Okay. So any questions? We're talking about a lot of stuff, I know. Andrew.
So, back to your question of do we have any record of embellishment? We do have in our Gospels sections that are credited as these passages don't appear in some of the earliest manuscripts. So there is evidence that the record of what the Gospels were did have some insertions and some changes over time. A skeptic could point to that and say, okay, they're willing to admit that these sections were added, but you don't know what else may have been added. So it does kind of go back to just a question of the credibility of the Gospels themselves. But looking at those passages as proof of embellishment, I look at those and I see nothing that changes the overall arc of the story. Certainly nothing that adds a key critical part that is not present in any of the other Gospels. You don't see an addition of that magnitude. What you see is usually insertions that were more helpful to the audience. Like in the ending of Mark, you sort of have an addendum in Mark 16 that includes the final dispersion of the apostles and the preaching of the message that it was carried from that point on. That, by all appearances, didn't appear in the first editions of that letter.
Yeah, I mean,
But it was an aid to the future readers as generations went on. They said, we'll make a footnote or a mention here that includes that part of the story that the other Gospels also confirm.
yeah, nothing new, just restatement of what's elsewhere. And also, because this is not, out in the public all the time, you can go look and find every single manuscript and piece of paper that's ever been found, because they're all on the internet, digitized and everything, and you can go read them for yourself. And there's not really this like conspiracy of what was there. You get to some of those editions and you see some of those first manuscripts where it was written in the margin as like they're like, oh yeah, this was a cool story too. And then later it gets added. It's a very clear, reliable history of transmission with the New Testament. It's just not a conspiracy. All of the evidence is out there for anybody who wants to go look at it. So there's you guys, everybody go learn Greek and textual criticism and share with us what you find with that. Okay. So on Wednesday, we'll pick up with the reflections. So we're going to talk about those, and then I just want to take a little bit to reflect as a whole on what we've talked about with Jesus' resurrection and the significance of that. So we'll just have, a couple more class periods. And if there's nothing else, then we'll be done for